St. John's Evangelical Lutheran Church in Toronto's West End, which raised issues of racial and ethnic discrimination. What you had was a formerly European stock congregation, which was now attended largely by newcomer Lutherans from Sri Lanka, Ghana, Zaire, Eritrea, and the West Indies. The church was taken over by a small council of largely of the old European stock believers, and the other congregants were kicked out. The fence was put around the church, and they tried to sell the church. The congregants then filed suit with raised a complaint with the Human Rights Tribunal, and then filed a class action suit to stop the sale of their church. There were both, here you had, quite clearly you could say, well, this has nothing to do with religion, they're all Lutherans. So the difference between the two groups is race, and so this is a question of race, visible minority status, ethnicity. But in fact, what the council was objecting to was that these people from these strange lands were not real Lutherans. And in fact, they were asked to provide proof that they were in fact Lutherans. And I've never heard of a case like that in a Canadian church. And right now, the Canadian Protestant churches are so desperate for membership, they don't really check their papers at the door. But we will certainly see more of this kind of controversy, which is to say, the blending of race, ethnicity, and religion together in these difficult questions inside the Christian churches and out in Canadian society. So, there are consequences to this. First, because of this new situation, because of the new immigration and the new makeup of Canada, the first is that very often anti-immigration and anti-multiculturalism sentiment is now expressed around religious issues. The second is that so that's one source of an increase of religious tolerance and discrimination in Canadian society. The other source is actually something we're not that used to in Canada, and that is that transnational ethnic, political, and religious conflicts can now be played out in Canadian soil. So Jewish tension. The Canadian Jewish and Muslim community are often in conflict here in Canada, but it has nothing to do with their competing needs and rights and interests on Canadian soil. It has to do with the Middle East. Muslims and Hindus clash over Kashmir and other issues of communalism. Hindus and Sikh clash over Khalistan, but the clashes are taking place here on Canadian soil. So that's a type of religious intolerance and discrimination that may increase as immigration does. So, the other problem is, of course, secularism. Secularism was the solution. Remember back, we had Christian Canada, it was discriminatory, and therefore we tried to secularize Canadian society. However, certain authors have pointed out that a closed secularism, an ideological secularism, can be just as unwelcoming to religious minority groups as a Christian Canada. In other words, that many of these groups feel ill at ease in a society that does not allow them to express their religious beliefs in public debates. So if the old feeling was that immigrants aren't true Canadians because they're not true Christians, you still hear that. You still hear that in the Quebec debates, the Hérouville declarations and others. The new declaration is these people are not legitimate or first-class or real Canadians because they're not secular, or they have the wrong kind of religion. In other words, they have a religion that is not, as Dr. Sullivan says, private, individual, belief, etc., etc. So, in other words, liberal Protestant Christianity is still the measure of what, sorry, let me throw off here by the beautiful timekeeper. I was going to say, fortunately, the rest of this is all really second rate. So the problem is, of course, that secular Canada is not entirely secular. It is, in fact, residually Christian. What do I mean by that? Well, the major institutions still bear the mark of our Christian past. In In other words, in their structure, not in their culture anymore, but in their structure. Why we have the social safety nets that we have, why we have the type of social agencies we have, is because they are secularized versions of institutions built by Christians. And therefore they have a certain structure, they operate in a certain way that others might not feel entirely comfortable with. Christian values still define very much Canadian values, public values. So when we have legislation that talks about things that are allowable, things that are reasonable, things that are not extreme, where do those words, where does our judgment around those words come from? Very often they're rooted in judgments that themselves are rooted in assumptions about reality, reasonableness, good, that come from our Christian past. So in a nutshell then, liberal Protestant Christianity then, in global terms, I'm speaking quickly and therefore globally tonight, that it's still the measure of what religion should be protected and promoted. So I was asked to give a few thoughts for the future, and here I think I'm totally out of my depth. Of course, we should continue to monitor and sanction traditional forms of intolerance and discrimination. I read the 1996 policy on CREED, and I was actually impressed. It's a very fun document. However, we need to go beyond that. We need to develop, especially, a sensitivity to lingering Christian privilege, both in its overt forms, Christmas as a civic holiday, God being part of the national anthem, etc., but also in its hidden forms, in its structural forms. The 7-day work week works very well for Christians and some others. It does not work very well for Buddhists, for example, whose feast days might fall on a Wednesday or a Thursday. So I'm not going to get into the next bullet point because my esteemed colleague who's following me is really going to talk about definitions of religions and how our definition of religion limits what we see and therefore what we can protect. And the final recommendation is, in general, is that we need to commit to a deeper multiculturalism. In other words, a multiculturalism that not only is one in which the majority dictates to the minority what is reasonable, what can be accommodated, but rather one in which there is a real dialogue between two groups, one in which we recognize the moral accomplishments of the past. I'm willing to say that secularization, the de-Christianization of the Canadian state, was in fact a real moral advance. So yes, to that. Yes, that we now embrace tolerance. Yes, that we now embrace reasonable accommodation. But really, yes, but. Yes, but we haven't gone too far. We haven't gone far enough. We need to embrace, and here I know Lori Bean is going to sue me if I don't mention her name, attached to the concept of deep equality. But we need to move past kind of that old model of multiculturalism to one in which the dominant group in society, the majority, allows itself to be changed in dialogue with the minority. And that will be a very, very difficult thing to do because, of course, many groups in the society that we want to accommodate, that we want to recognize, will be illiberal, and a liberal democracy has a hard time dealing with groups that reject liberalism. So I expect that this will be the subject of the talks for the next few days, and I'm very much looking forward to participating in the public dialogue on religion and the law and human rights. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Seljak. A very broad stage in which to set in a short period of time, and thank you for doing such a good job of that. I would now like to introduce Professor Winnifred Sullivan, who is a professor of law and director of the Law, Religion, and Culture program at the University of Buffalo, the State University of New York. She studies The Intersection of Religion and Law in the Modern Period, and has authored several books on the subject. She holds a JD and a PhD from the University of Chicago, and is going to talk with us tonight about regulating religion using a very interesting case from the U.S. District Court in Florida, Warner and Boca Raton, to illustrate the problems of definition. Thank you for coming here from Waterloo, and please welcome Professor Sullivan.